I'm Pat Shannon. I come from Cranny and I still live in Cranny, and I am the grand-nephew of Peadar Clancy, the Irish patriot, who was born in November, 9th November 1888 and was cruelly murdered at 11 o'clock on Monday the 22nd of November 1920, which was the day after Bloody Sunday. My connection with Peadar Clancy is that Peadar's brother, who lived in the home place, his name was James, and his daughter was Kathleen. He had 3 daughters and 1 son, and I'm the son of Kathleen, who married my father, Bill Shannon, and moved about a mile back the road from where they lived. Peadar was the son of James and Mary Keane, and they had a family farm there in Cranny, just about 100 yards near the school. He was better known as Peter when he was young, and he was the youngest of 7 boys and 6 girls. His father, in actual fact, moved in to the family home because the family home was Keane before the marriage. 3 of Peadar's siblings died very young, and I just want to give out a lot of work about what happened with Peadar Clancy and how he lived his life, but I also want to bring in some family aspects to it. I have some letters that Peadar wrote to his brother in America, in Chicago. Now, Peadar had a distinctive style in writing his letters, but instead of writing directly to his brother, in actual fact, he wrote to his new nephew at the time. And he had a photograph got of his nephew, and writing to his nephew, who must have been only a baby, maybe of less than a year, he said, "You're a good-looking fella." And he just passed another comment afterwards saying, "This is a family disease." So he was bragging a little bit about the good looks of the Clancy family. He also wrote to his brother about his newborn niece. Now, he didn't name the niece, but I'm going to take it that was referring to my mother. And he said, "My newborn niece is a queen and an angel." So lovely words to have written by him. He had a very close relationship with his brother, Jamesy, as he was known. And Jamesy looked after his elderly parents there. 2 years before Peadar was born, Cranny National School was built in 1890. Sorry, 2 years after Peadar was born. And I just want to give you little facts about what Ireland was like back in those years. In 1870, only 3% of Irish land was owned by farmers. By 1906, it had moved up to 29%. And by 1916, 64% of the land held in Ireland was owned by farmers. So we had moved quite a little bit in those few years. Also, another fact was over 48,000 cottages were built by 1921, and these were a new phenomenon at the time. And some of those cottages that were so well built, they have been reconstructed and they still exist today. Peadar moved 100 yards back the road to go to his school. I presume, born in 1888, he would have gone to school in 1893 and would have been at school for about 15 years, which would have brought him up to about 1906. There he was an apprentice draper to Dan Maloney in Kildisher. That was his first job. Just a fact about his family there as well, the census were taken in 1901 and in 1911. In the 1901 census, Peadar's father's age was listed as 63, but by the time 1911 came in, he was 74. Now it was only 10 years, yet he'd moved on 11. His mother had a more dramatic rise. She was 54 in the 1901 census, but she was 70 in the 1911 census. And I suppose this was the fact that an old age pension had come into being at the time, and suddenly people's ages went up. Whether they were genuine or not, we cannot prove. But if we take the mother being 54, it would mean that in 1901, which was 13 years after his birth, it sounds logic, and he was youngest of the family. But how she moved to 70 I don't understand. Also in 1901, the family farm had 4 outhouses. This was one of the facts that was recorded in the census, but by 1911 it had moved to 7 outhouses. So my grandfather obviously was a fairly progressive farmer, and the farm is a pretty good farm even at this day. Peadar was described by the local people in Cranny at the time as a tall and strong and no mean athlete. When he went as an apprentice draper in 1906 to Dalmaloney in Kildysart, he started off his apprenticeship there. He helped his sister Susan, who lived in Kinlay, Knockalock, and he used to send her £10 at Christmas time, plus clothes from where he would have access to it in the drapery. He talked to my mother at one stage when she can remember him talking about the commemoration of the 1798 rebellion. And when that was commemorated in 1898, Peadar was 10 years of age. And he told her that there were pikes made by a local blacksmith called Frawley in Cranny, and that the farmers around Cranny had a demonstration, just marched up and down the village using those pikes as what was used in 1798. He was a founder of the Sinn Féin movement in Kildysart, and he was elected secretary of Sinn Féin of the Irish Gaelic League from 1910 to 1913. He also moved to Newcastle West for a period and then moved on to Youghal, where he spent 3 years up until he moved to Dublin in 1913. His first place of abode in Dublin was at the Liberties in 70 New Street. Now I'm going to move on as Peadar the Rebel. He joined the volunteers there and became a member of the C Company 1st Battalion. All through that period from 14 onwards, 1914 to 1916, it was his responsibility of raiding arms. And anywhere he could find arms, all around Wicklow, Dublin, Meath, he was very good at identifying where they are and carrying out raids. And I'll describe some of the raids he did as I go along. I know in Kilcool he smuggled over 600 rifles, and he brought them to various locations in Dublin where they were stored. And these were kept in different areas, including Rathmines Church inside, under the vaults that were hidden there. He was regarded as having great ability to keep a secret, that people could talk to him about what was happening and he could keep it and transfer it to the relevant people, particularly as regards their plans on how to raid. He trained every Thursday at 41 Parnell Square, and his area, because of his responsibility, his area covers Stoneybatter, Smithfield, Arbor Hill, so to be the area from the central city nearly out to Euston Station. He paid a visit home in December 1914 to meet his parents, and he described again in a letter to his brother in the States that his nieces and nephew were nervous of him. They were obviously hearing stories about he being involved in guns and ammunition and all that, and there was a fear within the nephews and nieces at the time that he would kill their father, which was an interesting light that he mentioned in his letter. Easter 1916, the rebels planned a whole lot of things, and there was a very strong rebel movement in Carrickahole, Cranny and Kildysart, where people got up together, they fought, they carried out raids on the military. His responsibility was in Dublin at the time with the C Company, and he operated from the front of the forecourts. He had 80 members of the IRA working with him, and during that period people have described him as showing courageous, a competent and very charismatic type of person. One colleague said that Clancy was the bravest man who ever went out in the Easter week. He was fascinating and epitomised the attractive heroes of Irish history. He was promoted to lieutenant during the Easter week, and he was in charge of the Bridge Street barricades. And to do this, what he did was he broke a huge amount of glass and placed it on the streets all around Bridge Street. He then arranged a barricade of horse lorries, a taxi, porter barrels, stones, bed-ins, wires, anything he could, just to block the exit from Euston Station or King's Bridge right through to the docks. He also had coming among people working for him, and one was a lady called Bridget Lyons. And even though we know Peadar never married, this Bridget Lyons later described him as that she had a great crush on him. So that's the only thing we know about his romantic life at the time. They prevented wagons of ammunition which was leaving the docks heading for the Phoenix Park, and they started shooting when the wagons started coming towards the quays, with the result that the English had to pull back and had to hide away, and they couldn't get their ammunition to the Phoenix Park. They tried again on a Tuesday of Easter week and fired on, but Clancy fired back and went into where they were firing from and captured 5 rifles and 1,000 rounds of ammunition to supplement the stuff they already had. At 9 a.m. on Thursday morning of Easter week, 20 soldiers tried to reach the city centre, but again Clancy fired on them with his men, and a Lord Dunsany was captured by Clancy. Now, Lord Dunsany later commented that Clancy was a gentleman, and even though he was held hostage by Clancy, he was well looked after, and he did have a wound, but they maintained that Clancy did not do the shooting. During that week and towards the end of the week, Kavanagh's pub at the bottom of Bridge Street was captured by the soldiers, and they started firing towards the forecourts to break up the barricade. Clancy singularly left his position in the barricade and moved over the bridge a distance of 45 metres, carrying, well, I suppose 45 yards at the time, we were into metres now, carrying petrol. And he fired the petrol into the downstairs window. And that was one step, it's a courageous step. But he also had to double back over the bridge and get at the other side of the barricade, which he did successfully, with the result that the building went on fire and a whole lot of other buildings in the nearby, which meant that the English who were firing from that bar had to leave what they were doing. Obviously, they all had to surrender, and in May 1916, he was sentenced to death and was brought to the UK. The sentence of death was later commuted, and he was brought for imprisonment to the UK. He was sent to Portland Jail in Dorset. But there again, Clancy's natural leadership qualities were recognised, that both Clancy and, who we now know, Eamon de Valera, were approached by the prisoners to break the prison regulations where they were confined in the prison. Because he was recognised as a leader, the English transferred him to Lewis Prison, and he was there for over a year, where he taught Irish to the rest of the prisoners that were there. He was a good guy to do some practical jokes, and the governor of the prison wanted his residence, I presume was within the grounds of the prison, painted. So Clancy and his comrades were doing the painting. 3 of his rooms were painted green, white and gold, and it was only in some months later that the governor realised that the colours were significant to Peadar. They also went on strike in the prison there, and after a while he was sent back to Portland from Lewis Prison. They were all released in June 1917. Clancy came home then to Cranny, and you'd think his route would be from Dublin to Limerick to Ennis, but in actual fact his route was Dublin to Limerick and continued west, I presume by train, towards Newcastle West, and then moved up towards an area west of Fines and crossed the River Shannon to a place called Shanahay, which is in our parish in Cranny. And there, the Reedy family brought him across from the Limerick side of the Shannon to Shanahay, and he then got on a bicycle to come home for December 1917. There were Republican flags on all the churches in Coolmeen, Cranny, Kilmurray, Macban and Labashida. Flags were also shown up in the school in Cranny and in the Six Crosses dispensary. After this, a vacancy arose in East Clare, the MP vacancy, and Clancy was nominated to run. However, at a meeting at the Old Ground Hotel in Ennis, where over 200 delegates attended, Clancy withdrew his nomination to allow Eamon de Valera to go forward. Now, that's what history's shown, but if Eamon de Valera, who was coming from Limerick to Clare. They felt that he would be a better candidate. But Clancy totally supported Eamon de Valera, and he attended meetings all over Clare, Newmark and Fergus, Quinn, Ennis, Corofin. And on the 10th of July 1917, the count was completed, and de Valera received 5,010 votes compared to his the guy going against him, Lynch, who 2,035. Clancy travelled with de Valera then on a lap of honour around the county to Ennisdiamond, Ballyvaughan and Kilrush and other towns around the county to celebrate de Valera's success. Clancy visited West Clare several times from that time onwards, organising and reorganising volunteers, including his own school. And he heard the children sing in Cranny School, and their song was "Who is Ireland's Enemy?", which he liked very well. He commented to his brother in the US in July 1917, another letter which we have copies of, talking about the harvest. And he was saying that the harvest was absolutely splendid in Cranny, and that the high prices of food during this period showed, because a war was going on, the World War, bread had increased by 70%, meat had increased by 190%, and potatoes had increased by 250%, which were massive increases. So here was the Clancy commenting on a splendid harvest, because obviously they were doing well, they were able to produce all those commodities themselves. Clancy also travelled north to support candidates who were fighting elections in the north, and in Cookstown a lot of stones were thrown at him because of his politics. He was nominated, as I said, for MEP late 1918 in the rest of County Clare, but Brian O'Higgins got the selection and was elected. Now we move on to his other work. He's Vice Brigadier in Dublin Brigade, and he was also Director of Munitions. Dan Breen was a great friend of his, and he was shot in a raid in Tipperary and was brought to hospital in Dublin, and he was visited daily by Peadar Clancy. Dan Breen in his book has commented about his friendliness, and he said that his shop, which he ran, the outfitter's shop in 94 Talbot Street, was a great contact for the country people to come. Bridget Lyons, the lady I spoke earlier about, who had a crush on him, described Peadar at the time as courteous, chivalrous gentleman. And Kathleen Clark, the wife of Tom Clark, pressed Peadar to describe how her husband had been treated by the English, and his comment to her was, "No, it is better not, you know." In other words, he wasn't even able to describe the horrendous torture that was given to Tom Clark, so he wouldn't even tell his Kathleen Clark how it happened. In November 1919, Clancy led an armed IRA raid to seize weapons. Again in February 1920, he attacked a train at Amiens Street and succeeded in obtaining a number of rifles. In actual fact, there were 75 rifles seized in that. He went to Arklow explosive factory, and he got a contact who worked in the gas company, and he went as an inspector of the gas company, Dublin Gas Company, and he was able to get into the munitions factory, and he again organised a lot of ammunition which he used again in Dublin, and that's where they were hidden all over the city. He organised a Mountjoy jailbreak in March 1919, and in this he used special whistles that the lads inside had whistles, he had whistles, and they were able to communicate through whistles. He used a rope ladder and blankets to ease the fall outside. So it was Clancy who threw the rope ladder over the wall, prisoners were able to get up, and then he organised blankets for them when they fell off the wall on the other side. However, the guys were so big and the fall was so long coming down that they went right through the blankets, and a lot of fellas got injured on their way down. In March 1920, an ex-British soldier was executed in Limerick. This guy was going around in the name of Peadar Clancy, and he was trying to infiltrate the Sinn Féin groups and area groups. But he did this in Limerick and Kerry. But then somebody who knew Peadar Clancy met him one day and realised that he was not the Peadar Clancy they should have been doing, and he was subsequently executed. Another incident was in his shop in Talbot Street was raided several times, and this time they were coming in to search, and Clancy had an IRA man present who he knew was armed. When the British soldiers came in to do a search, he said to the officer, "Do you mind if I serve this customer first?" And he was allowed to do so. He then said, "It's size 15.5, and he put 2 shirt collars, which came separately to the shirts in that time. You got a shirt collar with a little button on it, and he put 2 shirt collars into a box and said, "You can pay another time." And the IRA man was able to leave. He was armed, and he was able to leave without the British soldiers realising, thinking he was just another customer. Now, I want to move on to the Mountjoy hunger strike in 1920. And again, I'm going to use a book written by Cormac and Stefano Corrie on Peadar Clancy. It was launched back in 2016. But I'm going to read a few passages of it because they're giving descriptions of what Peadar Clancy was like as a leader. And this is March 1920. So they were in Mountjoy jail, and as well as convicted prisoners, Mountjoy also held Republican prisoners who had yet to be convicted of any offence. These men had their own council to represent them. There were 3 men on that council: Tom Hunter, who was the partner of Peadar Clancy in the shop in Talbot Street, journalist Frank Gallagher, and Peadar Clancy himself. It was Clancy who was about to determine the course of events. Hunter and Gallagher were more amenable to compromise than Clancy, but Clancy was able to impose his will upon them. That would prove significant. The question was, would he be the man whom one prisoner described as someone who inspired feelings of confidence and loyalty to the prisoners? Clancy would need the loyalty and confidence of his fellow Republican inmates for the coming battle, and it might easily be argued that he exploited those feelings. Clancy was lucky with some of those who were in prison with him. They were from Tipperary and all over Dublin. The Republican prisoners' demands were simple. They wanted the authorities to concede prisoner of war status. On the 29th of March, the authorities were told that if this was not conceded, then a hunger strike would begin on Easter Monday, April the 5th. This would be the largest hunger strike ever attempted by Republican prisoners, and there was always a danger that there would be a split amongst the prisoners during the strike. Todd Andrews, who would be the grandfather of President Ryan Tubridy, he was still only a teenager, and he was later a minister, recalled a moment that Clancy addressed the assembled prisoners and told him about the decision to strike. And these are Todd Andrews' words. He said that as volunteers we were prisoners of war and that we had a right to be treated as such. He had, on behalf of the prisoners, conveyed that demand to the governor, who had ignored it, and he insisted on treating us as prisoners on remand for criminal offences. Despite the fact that no charge had ever been made against us, in these circumstances it had been decided that, as a protest, we should go on hunger strike until we were recognised as prisoners of war or released. He was careful to explain that anyone undertaking the hunger strike must do so only after full consideration of the possible consequences to himself and his family. Anyone deciding not to participate was assured that such a decision would not be held against him now or in the future. Clancy's speech had the desired effect, strengthening the resolve of any potential waverers and uniting the group. Reflecting on the event years later, Todd Andrews went even further, saying, "As an IRA man, I would probably have lacked the courage to stand aside and refuse to take part in the hunger strike. But any reluctance I might have had would certainly have been overcome by the extraordinary impact Clancy's personality had on me. He left on me an indelible impression of a superman, a man whose commands I, at least, would have had a compulsion to obey, as if I had been hypnotized." So these were pretty strong words coming from Todd Andrews. By the 9th of April, 90 men were on strike. And I'll just move on a further bit. With the commencement of the hunger strike, there was a genuine sense of excitement amongst the prisoners. It helped how well many of them felt, even after days without food. That surprised the prisoners. Clancy, on the other hand, was feeling the strain. Gallagher, his friend, noted that he was more worn than the rest of us, for his energy, his eagerness had made it impossible for him to rest. With the initial refusal of the government to concede their demands, Gallagher warned Clancy that the prisoners were in for a rough time. Clancy was bullish, replying, "The tougher the better. The real fight is beginning outside, and fiercely I'm going to be out for it." Clancy remained steadfast in his optimism. He told Gallagher and Hunter that letting us die by inches frightens them. "Believe me, they'll cave in as soon as they see we're in earnest." Unlike the others, Clancy was certain about victory. "We'll win it this time," he said. If we are hard as iron with ourselves and refuse every compromise, well, we'll end it in a week." Later, the governor came to meet Hunter, Gallagher and Clancy. He had a new offer. 8 of the prisoners were to be transferred to Wormwood Scrubs in England. The 8 included the 3 whom he addressed. They would be given political treatment. And of course the strike would end. However, Peadar spoke with stinging contempt, hot, bitter words. The governor, who wore an eye, one of those single eye patches, his mouth opened and the eyeglass fell to the end of his long black cord. The torrent of abuse sounded along the silent corridor, engulfing everything. "Tell them all or none." And then he whispered back to his friends, "They're beginning to break." From the beginning of the hunger strike, people had gathered outside the prison holding vigil. The crowds grew so large that by the end of the week there was a permanent potential mob outside the prison. These people prayed, sang songs and shouted encouragement to the strikers. And fearful of an effort to storm the prison, the authorities placed machine guns on the walls and tanks around the perimeter. The governor, with an offer of political status, then came with an offer to offer to 20 men. And Gallagher told him, "Mr. Clancy answered that yesterday." Gallagher then went to Peadar Clancy's cell, and Peadar replied, "Buy or buy," which is a kind of a saying that even his nephew, who I knew, John Clancy, my uncle, used to use as well in a lot later years. There was a general strike all over Dublin. The railway station went out on strike and post office went out on strike. And they were offering parole then, that you'd sign a document that you'd get parole if you left. But again, Clancy stood fast and would not accept it. He said they were free men, they had come in, they weren't guilty of anything. And in the end, the English came in and they were all released. So that's just, I wanted to quote those facts, and there's a lot more there in that book as well, which is well worth reading. Now, he was strong as well in other areas. He had a great friend called Art O'Donnell who looked after activities here in Clare. But Art wasn't very good at sending documents back to the head office in Dublin, and Collins had written to Art O'Donnell a few times to get documents back. They wanted to know what was happening down in Clare. And Peadar, because of his charismatic kind of character, he was sent to Clare, and Peadar removed Art O'Donnell, even though he was a great friend of his, from his position, and replaced him with a guy called Peadar Clancy, who wasn't a direct relation of his. On the 1st of June 1920, Peadar acted as a solicitor's apprentice and moved into the King's Inn. He got a permit to move in as a solicitor's apprentice. And while he was in there, he saw where the guns were. There was 2 loose machine guns. And later on, he organised with his men, good timing, careful planning, and he got 2 loose machine guns out of it and 25 rifles. Again, on the 19th of July 1920, at Kingsbridge, Clancy was in charge, and they got 12 rifles and 1,000 rounds of ammunition, yes. And they went in there on the understanding, he gave orders, there'll be no shooting, we don't want to get shot, or we're not going to hurt anybody else, and they managed to do it. Kevin Barry was a great friend of Peadar Clancy at the time, and even though he was only 18, he worked very closely with Peadar, and in actual fact, in recent years, I've got a lock of Peadar Clancy's hair which was sent to me by the family, Barry's family in Dublin, Kilbarry's. Now we're coming to the planning of the Bloody Sunday, which was planned for 9 a.m. on Sunday, the 21st of November. And Peadar, with his colleagues, and at this stage he was with Dick McKee, who was one of the guys to die with Peadar, and they were in Vaughan's Hotel, which is on 29 Parnell Square. They had a meeting there, and they were tipped off. They were planning to attack a whole lot of British military guys who had found their addresses all over the city, and the attack was planned for 9 o'clock on Sunday, the 21st of November. On Saturday night, they were meeting in Vaughan's Hotel, and Conor Clune from Quinn was up on different business, was totally innocent, and he was there as well in the hotel. However, Clancy got a tip from the hotel porter that they were about to be raided. So he and McKee left and moved to a safe house just down the street to Fitzpatrick's. However, they were being followed by a guy who was going to give information to the British. When they were in Fitzpatrick's, they burned the list of names and addresses of all the people who were to be executed. And they had just about completed that task on this Saturday night when 15 lorries of soldiers arrived. Obviously, the guy who was spying on them had put a little piece of a tag onto the knocker of the door to show where Clancy had moved, and Clancy and McKee had moved. The raid lasted 2 hours, and Clancy and McKee were brought to Dublin Castle, and there they met Conor Clune, who had been brought directly from Vaughan's Hotel. The raids on the English took place at exactly 9 o'clock on Sunday, the 21st of November in 1920, and 11 British intelligence officers were killed, plus 2 auxiliaries, and one man decided to kill himself, shot himself. Later on that afternoon, on Sunday afternoon, we know of the incident at Croke Park where 14 innocent people were killed. And Michael Collins took the capture of Peadar Clancy and Dick McKee very badly, and he did everything trying to find out where they were being held. Obviously, from the events of Sunday morning, and with Clancy and McKee and Clune in Dublin Castle, they were going to get a rough treatment, and this is what happened. They were brutalised, and lots of stuff happened to them. And at 11 o'clock on Monday, the 22nd of November, Clancy, McKee and Clune were all shot, and Clancy, they set up, the English then tried to cover up, saying that the 3 lads were trying to escape, and that Clancy used a shovel but missed one of the guys. We know that Peadar Clancy was shot 5 times, and we know it from people who saw the body afterwards that he was tortured. My grandfather, James Clancy, attended the funeral with Michael Kelly from Cranny, and Michael Collins arranged for the 2 lads to be dressed in uniform, and he pinned a note to their coffins, 2 of Ireland's best soldiers, dated 25th of November 1920. Funeral was from the Port Cathedral, and they are buried in Glasnevin Cemetery. Following that, several roads are named after Clancy. We have Clancy Park here in Ennis, and there are several roads in Dublin, the Finglas area, were named after Peadar Clancy, and indeed Dublin Castle has a room named Clancy Room. The Island Bridge Barracks was renamed Clancy Barracks in 1942, and of course that barracks is now closed down and is now known as Clancy Quay. In 1967 there was a bust of Peadar Clancy erected in the square in Killycerd, and in 1975 Cranny National School, which was a new school, was named Peadar Clancy Memorial School. And in 1998 we started a festival in Cranny, which is the Peadar Clancy Festival, which has lasted now 22 years. Peadar's father died the year after him. He died on the 4th of July 1921, and his mother died 4 years afterwards. Peadar's sister died in 1970. My mother has told many stories of Peadar Clancy. She was 8 when he was killed, and she often spoke of getting suit lengths delivered from the outfitter shop in Dublin to her father for making clothes for family members. It's 100 years now since Peadar died, and on the 22nd of November this year we're hoping to do something special in Cranny to commemorate it. The family continues. His his nephew John continued farming there, and now Peadar, namesake of Peadar, is farming in Cranny, in the home house where he was born. Other family members are the Clancys, the Shannons, my own family, Sheehans in Kildysart, and Careys in Kilrush. They were directly from the James Clancy's family, and then from his sister's family there's the O'Connells, Nealans, Grogans. He was a great guy. He's a guy that the family and all his relatives are very proud of, and indeed a lot of family members in America still make contact regarding Peadar Clancy's. So I think his name will live long.